Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We're just going to give everybody a minute to get in before we get started. All right. Thanks for joining us today. Welcome to On the Park Bench, a public square conversation brought to you by the Congress for the New Urbanism. On the Park Bench presents interactive conversations with thought leaders in new urbanism and allied industries, providing an opportunity for the audience to engage in real time. The webinar series is a platform for CNU members to engage, debate, and collaborate on the pressing issues of the day. Today's webinar is Authors Forum, Climate Resilience for an Aging Nation with Danielle Arigoni. You can share your thoughts on hashtag #OnTheParkBench at www.tinyurl.com/OTPBfeedback. And you can join us for upcoming webinars. On Tuesday, December 19th, join us for Planning for Physical Activity. Amy Groves of Dover Cole, Wade Walker of Kittleson Associates, and John Zimmerman of Active Towns Initiative discuss planning for physical activity through parks, safety, streets, and livable transportation, as exemplified by a highly touted recent plan for Lake Wales, Florida. CNU's Rob Studeville will moderate. You can register online for this webinar at cnu.org/resources/ontheparkbench. And be sure to save the date for our 32nd Annual Congress. CNU 32 will be in Cincinnati, Ohio on May 15th through 18th, 2024. This is the premier national event bringing together policymakers, planners, urban designers, developers, advocates, and more to engage with the trends and challenges related to building community. You can learn more at cnu.org/CNU32. And CNU has lots of opportunities for you to participate in the lead up to CNU 32. If you are a CNU member, be sure to propose your charter amendments by December 3rd. Charter amendments will elevate those aspects of our shared practice that members consider fundamental to new urbanism. Also, please remember to submit session proposals for CNU 32. We are soliciting proposals for classes and meetings with an emphasis on sessions that explore the Congress focus of restorative urbanism. Those are due December 5th. And the 2024 Charter Awards are open for submissions through the end of the year. Winning projects represent major contributions to building more equitable, sustainable, connected, healthy, and prosperous communities. Submissions are due December 31st. And now for today's webinar. Danielle Arigoni is an urban planner and community resilience expert. She currently serves as Managing Director for Policy and Solutions at National Housing Trust, where she provides strategic direction for the organization's sustainability and resilience policy efforts, and oversight and guidance for NHT's state and local advisory services. She is also author of Climate Resilience for an Aging Nation, which explores the impacts of climate change on a rapidly growing demographic, people over 65, and the need for community-scale solutions to reduce risk for all. Prior to joining NHT in 2022, Danielle was the Director of Livable Communities at AARP, where she designed and implemented a robust nationwide initiative through print publications, technical assistance programs, and advocacy to create more vibrant communities for all ages. From 2000 to 2017, Danielle held a number of leadership positions at US EPA and HUD, where she led efforts to advance smart growth, climate resilience, and sustainable communities. Danielle holds a master's degree in city and regional planning from Cornell University, a bachelor's degree in planning from University of Oregon, and serves as a board member for Smart Growth America, and is chair of the board for the League of American Bicyclists. And I am Lauren Mayer, Communications Manager at CNU. As a reminder, please use the Q&A function to ask questions as they occur to you, and I will turn it over to Danielle. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Lauren, and thank you for being here today. I'm really excited to be with CNU members and be able to share this information with you and hopefully spark some new thoughts and conversation in the urbanism world about these two big trends that I see happening, and I think are important for all of us to have our eyes on. Let's say I think I may have accidentally turned on subtitles. If I did, apologies for that. But I hope that is visible. If it's not, please let me know. The slides, that is. So thanks again, Lauren, for the introduction. Thanks to Rod for doing all that you do to support CNU's communications, and particularly to Mallory for facilitating this introduction, and for both Mallory's and Margaret's leadership. I want to do a quick advertorial for the organization that I work for, National Housing Trust. We're a national nonprofit affordable housing developer with about 35 properties here in the Mid-Atlantic and up and down the Eastern Seaboard, but we also do a lot of other things too. We lend for housing and community development. We install solar on affordable housing, and we finance a number of projects, and we do policy work, which is the field that I lead. So we're really working very hard to bring climate investments into affordable housing, recognizing that those are the folks who are in many cases, most impacted by climate, and their housing needs to be able to be responsive to that. But the purpose of today's conversation really is to hone in on a different kind of set of trends. These two concurrent, but I think mutually impactful trends, both the aging of our population and, of course, our changing climate, both of which have the potential to radically disrupt how we plan and design our communities, but differ really in the degree to which their changes are evident. I think for most people, but still not all, there's little doubt anymore that climate change is real. It's here and it's impacting our daily lives. In the US and across the world, people now endure summers characterized by code red air quality days and winters by either too much or too little snowpack. Extreme heat and cold are becoming more common. Hurricanes are increasingly frequent, intense, and deadly. And many other parts of the country face periods of extreme rainfall and wildfire smoke in ways that are truly unprecedented. We see clear evidence of the impacts of climate change in the destruction that it leaves behind. In the US, NOAA tracks, the agency, NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, tracks disasters, nearly all of which are climate fueled, that result in at least $1 billion of damage. The number of billion-dollar disasters has increased each year. Since NOAA started tracking this information, the overall average has been 8 per year. Last year, there were 18 of these events, and as of November of this year, we were already at 25. These disasters include the full array of wildfires, storms, flooding, hurricanes, cold waves, and droughts, and reach nearly all corners of our country. Time and time again, we see that events of this scale lead to the loss of life and the devastation of homes and communities that will, in many cases, take years to recover from. This climate trend intersects with and compounds another that is less talked about and maybe less apparent, but which will nevertheless have a tremendous impact on our communities. We are, as a country and as a world, becoming older. People over 65 are the fastest growing demographic in the US. 100 years ago, just 1 in 20 people was over 65. Today, roughly 1 in 6 is. Moreover, by 2034, there will be more people over 65 than under 18 in the US for the first time ever. And that group will be increasingly diverse, with far higher growth rates among non-white populations than white older adults. This change represents a significant tipping point among a sizable share of our population. Yet it's one that frankly doesn't get the media coverage or discussion that it deserves. As a result, many community leaders, advocates, and planners are left with a poor understanding of what the shift means and what older adults' needs are. Part of the problem is that we lack a standard definition of who is an older adult. Is it when your invitation comes to join AARP, or when you qualify for the 55 plus retirement community, or when you start collecting Social Security at 62, or Medicare at 65, or something else? This poor understanding is exacerbated by the fact that we live in a youth-obsessed culture where any mention of aging is usually accompanied by the word anti in front of it, as well as by the fact that older adults continue to break the mold and shatter images of what it means to age. We see people running marathons in their late 80s. We saw Martha Stewart grace the cover of Sports Illustrated this year. And of course, we have the oldest sitting US president in history. Older adults continue to defy expectations and stretch the boundaries of what it means to age. But there are some inherent truths to aging when looking across the cohort. 1 in 6 live in poverty. 96% live independently outside of congregate facilities. Nearly 30% live alone. 20% don't drive. 1 in 9 live with Alzheimer's disease. 20% need help with activities of daily living, such as help hearing, communicating, and self-care. 40% have ambulatory limitations, such as walking or climbing stairs. And 80% live with 2 or more chronic medical conditions. It's a shortfall for all of us when we fail to acknowledge these realities and use them to inform how we design communities. So we have these 2 massive trends underway, each of which has its own set of institutions that work to address them. Engineers, data analysts, climatologists, emergency managers are working diligently to plan for the impacts of climate change. Meanwhile, gerontologists and demographers, healthcare professionals, and aging advocates are planning for an older, grayer future. That division of labor is often mirrored in state and local agencies, where the work is similarly siloed. One set of professionals working to manage public works, regulate utilities, and manage emergency response, and an altogether different set charged with promoting health and healthy aging. And therein lies the rub. We have these 2 or more siloed approaches responsible for tackling complex problems without a full understanding of how they intersect. As a result, there is too little focus on how and where climate change exacerbates risk for older adults and what that means for communities that are home to an increasingly large share of them. Planners and urbanists have a unique role to play in bridging that gap, and in many cases are already doing that. Already, new urbanists have a hand in crafting more age-friendly communities. A few years back, when I was directing the Livable Communities program at AARP, we struck up a partnership with CNU that materialized not only in code audits in dozens of communities, but also in this co-branded CNU AARP Handbook for Improved Neighborhoods that sought to weave together the tenets of new urbanism and code reform with the age-friendly principles pictured here that cover housing, transportation, public space, and more. We didn't explicitly tackle climate in that effort, but the lessons are applicable and relevant nevertheless. Design matters. Building streets, homes, and public places that foster connection and hold promise to reduce emissions. Incremental change is possible, starting with changes to lot coverage provisions or changes that allow for more mixed uses, then move on to stormwater reform, road diets, and completing the streets. And partnerships are key. Code reform, as with any other community scale changes, requires public support, and so a diverse array of champions is needed to drive that change. This is part of what makes the age-friendly framework so powerful. It's a chance to bring together disparate city departments, nonprofit actors, hospitals, and aging providers, all of whom share a goal for a more livable place for people of all ages. And that collaboration is frankly critically important because of the ample evidence that the lack of understanding about older adults' needs and this conventional siloed approach to building communities isn't serving older adults' needs well. It's evident in the lack of adequate benches and in parks and seating and shading at bus stops. It's apparent in the fact that we don't provide enough safe, affordable housing that is also accessible. We don't offer enough reliable, accessible, affordable choice in how to get around safely once a person stops driving. This is where the work of AARP's Livable Communities program, and especially its partnership with CNU and its members, is so important. Right now, there are more than 800 age-friendly states and communities that aim to create places that work better for people of all ages and abilities. If you haven't tapped into your own local age-friendly efforts, I highly recommend you do so. But there's so much more to do, especially when we consider the risks that are growing associated with climate change, if we are to create safe and resilient communities where people can age in place. Because right now, there's far too much evidence that we aren't creating places that serve older adults well in times of climate-fueled disasters. Looking back at the largest named disasters, the ones that occupy our collective memory, we see clear evidence of the fact that older adults bear the brunt of climate change and of our community-wide failures to consider their needs. Consider the fatalities resulting from Hurricane Katrina, California Camp Fire, the heat domes that covered the Pacific Northwest, Winter Storm Uri, Hurricane Ian, and more recently, the Lahaina wildfires. For nearly 2 decades, hurricanes, winter storms, wildfires, and extreme temperatures claim a far greater share of older adults' lives relative to the fact that they represent roughly 20% of the population. Older adults die at double, triple, or quadruple the rate as people who are younger. This trend line and the fact that it remains virtually unchanged over 20 years makes it painfully clear that we are failing to create communities that safeguard older adults in their time of greatest need. It's not like we haven't been told this was happening. News stories almost consistently reporting on the tragedy. But at a national level, there's not been a similar attention and focus. We simply have not made a commitment to solve this problem. So it caused me to wonder, what can we do about it? How can we begin to truly commit to creating communities that not only safeguard older adults' needs as they seek to age in place, but also do so with an awareness of how climate change compounds their risk? For me, I felt I could make a contribution by diving deep into the topic, ultimately sharing my perspective in the form of a book, Climate Resilience for an Aging Nation. Drawing on lessons learned throughout my career and even more learned during my year of research, I finally landed on 3 big takeaways that I think start to pave the way to solutions. First, we have to be clear-eyed in our understanding about how climate change is impacting older adults and accept that in many cases it impacts them more greatly. This has to start with more commitment to understanding who older adults are and what their needs are. Older adults are a varied group in ages and abilities, and more racially, ethnically, and linguistically diverse every year. Imagine for a moment the difference in climate-related needs faced by a healthy, engaged, financially secure 62-year-old compared to those of an 89-year-old living alone in substandard housing with chronic medical challenges and no savings, or a grandparent living comfortably in an intergenerational home with their child and her family, compared to one who is caretaking for an adult child with a disability or a spouse with dementia. It's essential to understand the financial, health, caregiving, housing, and mobility conditions faced by older adults first, in order to better understand how they intersect with and amplify their climate risks. Second, we need to recognize that individual and even institutional preparedness is not enough. One conclusion that I reached from my research is that these tragic lives lost aren't often the result of a failure of individuals to prepare. More often, they're the result of unrealistic expectations about what it means to be prepared for someone who lives on a fixed income, or who cares for a homebound family member, or who can't drive. They are also the result of systems-wide failures that impact the whole community, but especially older adults, and therefore must be dealt with at the community scale. Third, these and other reasons are why it becomes essential to work towards community-wide resilience. That means that all sectors and all disciplines have a role to play. Community planners, emergency managers, housing advocates and transportation planners, healthcare providers, utilities, and many more. This is no longer a job for any one sector or profession. It's a job for all of us. Furthermore, I believe that it is the job for all of us. After all, we all have older adults in our lives whom we love, and we all presumably hope to live in a community ourselves where we will be safe and secure in the face of changing climate. We are not on a path at the moment to create such communities. Therefore, we must redouble our efforts to build community scale resilience. If you do nothing more on this topic than listen to this webinar, I want to be sure that I leave you with a clear sense of what it means to bring a clear-eyed view to the risks faced by older adults in our climate future and how those disparities ultimately impact whole communities. I've already shared the tragic figures of how older adults are dying disproportionately in climate-fueled disasters. And frankly, when I began writing the book, I thought that was the worst of it. But it turns out that the impacts of disasters are far more varied, even more widespread, and frankly, at the same time, harder to observe and not therefore covered in the news, the way that fatality rates often are. For older adults who own their home and who have most or all of their retirement savings tied up in their home equity, disasters can be devastating. It's hard for anyone to rebound, but particularly difficult for older adults due to their limited access to capital, little time to rebuild savings, and long timelines for federal relief. Moreover, those 1 in 9 people over 65 who are struggling with cognitive decline, or those who aren't computer literate, may find the administrative burden of accessing disaster relief simply too hard or too complex. Disasters also impact the health of older adults, which matters a lot to those 80% of older adults who live with 2 or more chronic conditions. When roads are closed or the power goes down or transit service is interrupted, people in need of regular medical care are unable to access it. When disasters damage a home in ways that create further health risks, like when flooding damage leads to black mold, the impacts on health have a far longer timeline. And when all of those effects are combined with the trauma of experiencing climate-fueled disasters, it's no surprise that research shows that they lead to worse health outcomes for older adults. While I was motivated to write the book by looking at the impacts on disasters, it became clear to me that the impacts on older adults were prevalent in all the days outside of disasters as well, which in some cases ended up being even more deadly. We are all having to learn to adapt to our new normal as it unfolds every day. We just finished the hottest summer on record on Earth so far, which of course impacts everyone, but not everyone equally. I believe that climate change is wreaking havoc on older adults in a far more insidious and complex way. Periods of prolonged heat in particular are deadly for older adults. Extreme heat is now the leading cause of weather-related deaths in the US, killing more than all other weather-related causes combined. Heat-related illnesses lead to 12,000 deaths each year, and of those, 80% of the people who die are over 60. We saw this in stark relief in the Pacific Northwest heat waves of 2021, where 1,000 people died. In Multnomah County, where the largest number of people died, the average age was 67. That's because older bodies don't process excess heat the same way as younger bodies. Fatigue and weakness from heat exhaustion can be missed because they mimic other conditions, thereby going untreated. Famously, Eric Kleinenberg documented the importance of social connectedness in his study of the fatality rates among older adults during the Chicago heat waves of 1995. These realities means that things like design elements and street trees that provide natural cooling are essential, and that housing that fosters connection, especially for that 30% of older adults who live in their homes alone, can be life-saving. But it's not just heat that poses a risk. Wildfires and flooding also have an impact. Smoke from fires and black mold found in homes that have been flooded exacerbate respiratory challenges. Dust from drought and fires can increase the risk of heart attack, especially for people who are overweight or diabetic. Not surprisingly, our new normal means financial impacts on older adults too. Already, many older adults are challenged to simply afford their rent or mortgage. In 2019, there were 14 million households headed by someone 75 or older. Of those, 45% were housing cost burdened, paying more than 30% of their income for housing. Among renters, the figure was 76%. Considering housing prices in recent years, I fear what the next analysis reveals, which makes it even more important to create communities that provide affordable, attainable homes that work for older adults. But we all know that the true cost of housing isn't just what one pays for rent or mortgage. Already, low-income households struggle to afford utilities. AARP reports that nearly 1 in 5 households, low-income households, went without basic necessities for at least 1 month to pay an energy bill. That means that someone suffering in a home or apartment that is too cold or too warm is making real-time decisions about how much they can afford and how much discomfort they can withstand. In addition, flood and wildfire insurance premiums add to the cost of housing and are increasing as we develop more data-informed risk projections. FEMA is phasing in those changes, but it still means that some homeowners will see their premiums increase 18% every year for more than a decade. In real terms, that means that a homeowner in Louisiana would see flood insurance rates grow from $842 per year to over $5,000. In Florida, from $1,053 per year to over $4,000. And of course, more extreme temperatures leads to greater demands on that grid that lead to extended power outages. Blackouts are, of course, an inconvenience for everyone, but they represent a true hazard for older adults. And when they last several days, weeks, or even months, as has been the case in Texas, Louisiana, and Puerto Rico in recent years, those risks multiply. Just today, there was a great article in the Washington Post about the loss of life in Puerto Rico that is directly attributable to the prolonged power outage. It is definitely worth the read, and I highly recommend it. Because without power, people of all ages are left without access to clean water, fresh food, and basic utilities. But the lack of power is felt more acutely by people who rely on in-home medical equipment, such as oxygen machines or lifts, and by those who live on upper floor apartments and multifamily buildings without backup power, who can't manage the stairs, and who become effectively trapped until the power comes back on. All of this calls for a new commitment to creating more energy efficient homes in safer locations and buildings that cultivate renewable sources of energy so that the power can stay on. It also underscores the value of close-knit, walkable communities where older adults could more readily access centrally located resources like resilience hubs that are designed to provide basic services with on-site energy generation and storage. So what is it that we can do? How can we begin to integrate older adults' needs into a vision for climate resilience? And where do those intersect with new urbanist principles? It begins with rethinking what we mean by climate resilience. Naturally, it means more hard infrastructure, like seawalls and levees to protect communities, more green infrastructure to better manage flooding, particularly at small scales throughout a community in ways that enrich the public sphere. It would also mean finding ways to construct a more resilient grid that can withstand extreme conditions and keep the power on, and or integrating decentralized energy sources like community solar throughout communities. But it also includes more resilient housing construction, especially age-targeted housing, through stronger building codes and zoning reform. Resilience would also include policies that encourage smaller, denser housing that reduces utility consumption and cultivates a social network that can help in times of disaster, elements that are core to new urbanist principles. Community resilience would deliver a diverse transportation network that includes public transit and fosters biking and walking to provide safe, affordable, and reliable options for the 1 in 5 people over 65 who don't drive. Again, these are core tenets of new urbanism. But in addition, community resilience would account for the shading and the seating needs for people relying upon those services to ensure that they remain viable in extreme conditions. But many more sectors and diverse partnerships are also required to work towards that climate resilient future. You who plan and design communities know the importance of partnerships. And as I mentioned before, that is part of what makes the AARP age-friendly framework such a powerful tool. Partnerships are key to creating more climate resilient communities, but may involve new sectors that new urbanists typically don't work with. Utilities, for example, can implement payment systems that lower the seasonal cost spikes that may cause older adults to go without cooling or heating. They can encourage greater energy efficiency in homes and the use of renewable energy and battery storage to provide power when the grid goes down. They can do a better job of communicating planned power outages to reduce load on the grid in peak times and suspend service cutoffs for non-payment during times of extreme weather. Healthcare professionals can proactively address the issue of climate change in the course of medical care, as well as in community planning efforts so that older adults, caregivers, and local leaders better understand the risks of longer, hotter seasons or poor air quality days as they relate to underlying medical conditions that are prevalent among older adults. Healthcare facilities can become more engaged in designing communities when they serve as an anchor, but also in assessing how more decentralized needs can be served by mobile clinics to ensure that patients can access the help they need, even when transportation systems are disrupted. Emergency managers and climate resilience planners can more explicitly incorporate aging in their planning, not just for older adults who live in facilities, but also for the vast majority, 96%, who live in the community, often alone. Emergency managers can serve as both a resource and as leaders to help new urbanists advocate for better housing, transportation, and infrastructure solutions that are grounded in the realities of climate-related risks. And aging advocates can recognize that climate change is central to their work. They can be partners to you in integrating climate solutions that serve the needs of older adults. They can support you as experts on older adults' needs and help you establish relationships that cultivate a greater understanding of and consideration for older adults. When these and other disciplines center their work around how to reduce climate change risk for older adults, we create safer and more resilient places for all. With all that said, I hope that this has inspired you to want to learn more about this issue. The book goes into far greater detail, including 25 solutions across housing, transportation, utilities, and more that can help us move towards greater resilience for an aging nation. I thank you for your time and attention, because when we work to solve for the needs of older adults, we also serve for the needs of people on limited incomes, or who can't drive, or who live with disabilities. We solve for those who are often overlooked and not heard because they are isolated, either by choice or by circumstance. And we also serve the needs of our future selves by creating systems community-wide that better account for our changing abilities, needs, and risks as we age. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Danielle. That was really excellent. As somebody who's actually had the pleasure of reading your book, I highly recommend. And with that, reading your book and your presentation has prompted a couple questions from me that I'd love to start off with. And for those in the audience, you're more than welcome to use our Q&A function to ask questions as they occur to you. My first question is, you talked a little bit kind of about what we can do for design to help older adults and communities. I just want to know a little bit more about how do the inequitable urban design decisions we're already making kind of impact these communities and social interactions?
Yeah, I think, the first thing that comes to mind is transportation networks. And when we're not, fully allowing for or considering the needs of people who cannot drive, or frankly, going into a conversation about mobility, assuming that everyone can drive, I think that immediately underscores the or sort of reinforces some of the inequity in terms of access and opportunity, frankly, that is already present in so many communities. We see that when you see poorly designed transit systems that don't provide shelter for people to be protected from the elements when they're taking the bus, or frankly, in transit systems that space the stops too far apart or don't serve the needs where they're the greatest concentration of people who live, or frankly, even provide access to really important community resources like hospitals or senior centers. So I think those kinds of traditions of assuming a certain level of ability, assuming a certain level of access in terms of being able to drive, those are the assumptions and biases, frankly, that we bring to a lot of our work that reinforces some of the inequities that we see that not just impact older adults, but of course, it impact people of lower income, impact people with disabilities who don't drive, impact people, frankly, who choose not to drive. But that's a way of beginning to think, I think, about how to remedy some of those inequities is by examining it from the perspective and through the lens, really, of older adults.
Very true. Yeah, no, great answer. And then kind of on that same vein, I was wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the age-friendly framework that you mentioned, that's championed by AARP and the World Health Organization, and how that could better inform community design.
Yeah, I think, I really am a huge proponent of and believer in the age-friendly framework. I led that work for several years. I no longer do, but it's in very good hands with AARP crew and with lots of volunteers and staff throughout the states. The age-friendly framework is really kind of nested on 8 livability domains, if you will, about 3 of which are the built environment, so housing, transportation, and public space, and then 5 of which are nested in kind of the social infrastructure, if you will, communication, respect and social inclusion, things like that. The most powerful part of that framework, I think, is the ability to bring something to an elected official, because it does require the commitment by a local official to sort of commit to this process that says we value making this place a place where people can age well. And I think just by making that statement that we value examining our built environment and our social environment through the lens of older adults' needs and taking action to make those things better, I think is an incredibly powerful tool. It often it delivers a mechanism to engage very diverse folks in that conversation. So it's a way to bring in aging advocates and hospitals and transportation planners and housing advocates and the like. And the interesting thing about it is that many times it results in the exact same kind of solutions that a new urbanist would otherwise seek to achieve, or a smart growth advocate would otherwise seek to achieve, which are, we need more housing choices. We need better housing options for older adults when they want to downsize in the community that they love, but no longer need or want a large home. How, therefore, can we work together to bring about zoning reform that would allow for smaller, more compact development to occur? Similarly, some of those same, solutions come to bear when it comes to transportation. Age-friendly networks acknowledge that, or age-friendly plans acknowledge often that older adults don't drive in the same way that younger adults do, or choose not to, or are unable to. And therefore, how do we plan for their mobility needs so that they can remain active and involved in their community, so that they can live independently and access the services they need? That similarly brings about a great set of champions for investment in public transit, and exactly in those kinds of public transit amenities, bus stops, seating, shelter, cooling, better service, better communication around service, better service, transit training, all of the things that go into making a transit system work, which is so core to what new urbanists and smart growth communities are all about. There's a whole there are champions yet to be tapped, who come from the aging world for transit systems if you approach them and approach some of these challenges through the age-friendly framework.
Absolutely. Yeah. A theme that was very clear from your book and through this presentation is that if we cater to and work with older communities, it really does help everybody. It's really a rising tide that lifts all boats for sure.
Yeah, agreed. And one thing that I failed to mention, but bears calling out is the wonderful thing about age-friendly frameworks often is that they put aging advocates, they put older adults themselves at the planning table. So they are literally involved in assessing the challenges, figuring out solutions, working with departments and practitioners and community-based organizations to get those solutions implemented. And I think, there's the maxim of nothing about us, nothing for us without us. Age-friendly frameworks are a way to bring older adults into that discussion and create more than one seat for them at the planning table.
Wonderful. And then because we are CNU, I wanted to ask you a couple things about new urbanism too. And I was wondering, what do you see as the role of new urbanism in emergency preparedness and building community?
Yeah, I think it's fascinating because what I learned, my observation is that emergency management is really a very unique culture unto itself. It is a different discipline. I think it pulls a lot on sort of public safety, and many people in emergency management come from military or public sector domain, public safety domains, meaning that they approach the work very differently, I think, than many urbanists do, certainly than many aging advocates do. I think that there's a real opportunity for interrelationships between those two industries, for greater collaboration and work between them, because I think some of the solutions that urbanism advocates for, smaller scale development, more attention to design, more careful curation of the public sphere so that it serves multiple purposes, those are solutions that are going to be of interest to emergency managers as well, but they're not necessarily levers that emergency managers have any purview over. So I think the degree to which new urbanists can tap into what emergency managers' concerns are, and I know, for many years, ensuring access by fire trucks to new urbanist communities has been kind of a sticky wicket. It's been a challenging problem to solve because there's seemingly contradictory desires there to widen the streets for trucks, but narrow them for new urbanist purposes. But when you sit down together, you can actually find solutions, and that has proven to be the case, right? Roundabouts that have rollover curbs and things like that allow for the mobility that are a great concern to emergency responders, but still allow for new urbanist principles to be built. So I think that the main message would be collaboration and communication. And I think that thinking about what is it that emergency managers are seeking to do? They're seeking to deliver services. They're seeking to make sure people are informed. They're seeking to ensure that they have a way to support people in their time of need. All of those are things that new urbanists can help with and can be more thoughtful and intentional and including in their designs. So I think there's a lot of promise there in future collaboration.
Very exciting. Yeah, that is a very interesting way of looking at it. And then one final question from me before I turn it over to our Q&A, which is filling up quite nicely. Thank you, everyone. Which is when disasters do happen, as you were saying, as has been evidenced with climate change, we're just increasing the number every year. How can age-friendly approaches be integrated into recovery efforts?
Yeah, so I think and I'll be honest, I don't think that this has been an area where a lot of communities has focused yet. The age-friendly framework, for all of its promise, has not. It has kind of stayed in the emergency preparedness space, which is a very important space to ensure that older adults are informed and prepared for disasters. It hasn't necessarily transitioned over into recovery, but I think that there's a huge amount of promise. One of the things that we see from past disasters is that, and I was just thinking, I just went to a presentation in Oregon, and it talked about it. It was from Paradise, actually. So there's a presentation by the community of Paradise, California. They've been impacted, decimated by a wildfire several years ago. They were presenting at an APA conference I was at, and they talked about rebuilding. And I think, there's a lot of opportunity to bring an age-friendly lens to the challenge of rebuilding and rethinking some of the basic form of communities that may have been the byproduct of poor decision making in the past. Here's a chance to do it better and to do it differently. I'll be honest, I don't think that there has been a lot of work that, at least that I'm aware of yet, that has intentionally done that. I think there certainly have been efforts to bring urbanist principles to recovery efforts and rebuilding efforts, but I don't think that necessarily has included an aging lens. And I think that's some of the opportunity and the promise that I see here, which is to say, as we're rethinking about a community rebuilding from disaster, what are the things that we want to fortify and strengthen? And that might mean certainly better building standards, more fortified building design, better performing buildings. But it might also mean, more dense construction, hopefully, that puts older adults in closer proximity to one another. We know that from the Eric Kleinenberg research I referenced, the 1995 Chicago heat wave, proximity and connectedness were determinants of whether someone survived or not. And, in much of our auto-dependent, suburban, sprawling communities, they do not very well foster that kind of connectedness. In fact, they work against it. So I think there's, again, a huge amount of promise for integrating both new urbanist principles and age-friendly principles into recovery efforts.
Wonderful. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to some great questions from our Q&A. And this one is from an attendee who's just asking, Danielle, what brought you to this work? Do you have any special connection to the aging community?
Yeah, I mean, I guess a few different things. I've said this before, and I'll say it again. I believed myself. I'm a planner. I come out of planning, school and practice, and I believed myself to be sort of an aware, inclusive planner. I didn't realize, frankly, that my own blind spots when it came to older adults' needs until I joined AARP. And I really credit AARP with a lot of the education, and frankly, learned a lot from volunteers and staff there about older adults' needs. And I think, for me, once my eyes were opened to that dynamic and the degrees to which older adults are unseen, are not heard, are not proactively considered in planning efforts, it's hard to go back to being anything other than championing for older adults. I don't think I can ever leave that mantle behind. I will always and forever now be a champion for older adults' needs, because I think that when you center challenges in the needs of older adults, like I said in the presentation, you really do solve for a lot of other needs. You're solving for the needs of people who are low income or who live with disabilities or who are isolated, who don't speak English, by bringing a more intentional lens to a lot of our work. So I credit certainly AARP with lighting a fire under me for on the issue of older adults. And then when it comes to climate resilience, I credit my work at HUD and some of our work there, where we sought to fund resilient disaster recovery in 13 communities across the U.S. with a really innovative, competitive process called the National Disaster Resilience Competition. And what you saw in that was communities who had experienced natural disasters, huge disasters, really committed to building back better, building back in a more resilient fashion. That did not at the time necessarily focus on the needs of older adults. And again, I think that's where centering work in the needs of older adults will deliver a better outcome for the long haul. So yeah, I would say that's kind of what got me here. It's a weird, the book is kind of a weird amalgamation of a lot of different jobs I've had over the years, but it all comes together, I think, to meet these challenges I think that we face today.
Wonderful. Yes. And kind of building off of that, I have two questions, one from Tom Carey and Elliot Klimowski that I'm going to combine, which is, how would you recommend approaching dialogue with people over the age of 65, particularly those in leadership roles who may discard the notion of the challenges of aging that may be confronting them soon? And then in that same vein, how can you get them involved in advocating for policies to mitigate the climate emergency?
I think it starts with education and information. I really do. That's part of what kind of compelled me to write this book. Is I think I became a little haunted by the fact that when you see disaster after disaster, how many people who are older adults are dying predictably. It's hard to not be bothered by that. I think it's really hard to not be troubled and upset by the fact that we have somehow allowed this trend to continue over 2 decades. So I think, that's a great way to open the conversation with older adults, to say, if we were to have a disaster in our community tomorrow, the trend line shows that our older adults are going to die at much higher rates. Are we okay with that? And if not, what are the things that we can do to plan for that and to plan for a better outcome? And then I think, much in the same way I came to this realization myself, when you start to peel back the onion and pull back the layers, it's not just in disasters that older adults are dying or more, impacted. When I think about, the housing cost burden that older adults face, and when I think about the number of older adults that live at or below the poverty line, which are, it's about 15% of older adults who live at or below the poverty line. And you map that against, what would it mean for someone to be able to keep their home cool or warm in extreme conditions? What would it mean for someone who can't drive to be able to access groceries if they don't drive on a day when it's 110 degrees out and they literally can't walk out their front door? What are the services and programs and solutions that we need to just fill those immediate and urgent needs? I have a hard time believing that people aren't compelled, or people wouldn't be compelled, when you lay out a very real condition of need faced by older adults, because all of us can imagine someone in our family, someone we know, someone we have known who's passed on, who might have lived with similar challenges, but maybe didn't speak up about them, maybe didn't articulate them. It's really on us, I think, to be able to bring forward some of the needs of people who are otherwise isolated, who are otherwise overlooked, who are otherwise not being heard, and use that as a starting point for action.
Very true. Yeah, I can think of, family members of my own too, that these are definitely conversations we need to have and things
Yeah.
of that nature.
Yeah. And I would say, just on that, one of the things I've kind of realized is that aging in our country is a very private affair. We don't talk about it publicly. We don't talk about what are the sort of unique challenges of aging in America. It's very much left to each family, to each individual, to figure out for their own. And therefore, I think there's not enough opportunity, or we have not made the space for an intersection of what does that mean for our new climate future. If there are days of more wildfire smoke, if there are days of recurring flooding in our community where you can't take the bus or drive or walk, if there are days when extreme temperatures keep you in your home for 2-3 weeks, if the power goes out for 3 months, as it did in Puerto Rico, what does that mean for you and your ability to safely age in place? We're not having those conversations as a country. Hopefully we're having them as families, but not enough of them, and not often enough, I think.
Absolutely. And kind of in that same vein, talking about, power outages, what are some ways aging can be considered in utilities planning? And that comes from Dana Lazarus.
Yeah. So the good news is that there is some federal support already that kind of seeks to fill this need. So there's something called the LIHEAP program, which is the Low Income Home Energy Assistance Program. It's specifically targeting low income older adults, low income seniors, and it provides some offset for utility costs. The reality is it doesn't go far enough. So if you were to approach a utility to talk about how we can support older adults, I can think of a few things. One, how can you add on to or expand the availability of LIHEAP funds so that low-income older adults don't have to worry about the utility costs, that they don't have to weigh that decision of whether I can set my, thermostat down to 72, or do I need to keep it at 80 when it's 100 degrees outside because I can't afford the utility bill? Like, let's just make that a non-issue for older adults, particularly low-income older adults, so that they can live, literally, physically be in an environment that does not add risk to their lives. Utilities can help in that. Utilities also have a really unique mechanism, and they communicate with every single one of their ratepayers. So they have a direct line of communication to ratepayers through that monthly bill. That's a really important tool to use to get information out to older adults. It might be around the value of weatherization. It might be the value of replacing windows, or taking other, smaller cost efforts and getting those done in order to bring down utility costs. So much of utility bills are spent on buildings, or are the result of buildings that are not energy efficient, that are not weatherized. And utilities can incentivize that work for older adults. I imagine when the notion of a climate corps was announced a couple months ago, there's an opportunity there, whether it's sponsored by the utility or a locality, to to bring together a group of people who could go into older adults' homes and do, small fixes like that help them reduce energy costs. It's hard to imagine the utilities couldn't play a role in offering a program like that to some of their older adult ratepayers.
Very true. Yes, I think I've heard about the LIHEAP program, and it's interesting to see kind of other opportunities that could be out there. In that same vein of talking about kind of federal assistance, Francis Cole asks, is there an opportunity for FEMA to learn from new urbanism principles to better prepare for climate disasters? And the example Francis gives is an example are Katrina cottages that FEMA helped design and issued to flood victims in the wake of Hurricane Katrina.
I think there definitely is. And I would, I'd say in recent years, there's a new program out of FEMA called Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities, BRIC, Building Resilient Infrastructure. I think that's right. I think that's what I stands for, which awards grants for mitigation. So as much as FEMA is involved in recovery, which I do think is really important, and I think that was part of the question, there's also an incredibly important role that both FEMA and HUD play in climate mitigation efforts and preparing for disasters so that when they strike, it's not going to be as dramatic. And I do think that there is the great history of the Katrina cottages. I think there's a lot of openness and appetite within FEMA to think differently about older adults. I'll point to the fact that ARP and FEMA together collaborated on a disaster resilience toolkit focused on older adults, and that FEMA released a document entitled Expanding Mitigation for Older Adults. I believe is the title, something along those lines, that really focused in on why is it that older adults are at greater risk in disasters, and how can we as FEMA begin to counteract that. So I think there's an appetite in FEMA. And when it comes to design elements and testing on new solutions, I do feel like FEMA is very open to this. I obviously I don't work for FEMA. I can't commit them to this, but it seems to me that they're very open to that. And again, FEMA works through a set of regional offices. So I would suggest figuring out who are the regional staff in the area where you work and live, and inviting them to design charrettes and posing some of these questions to them in very practical ways to see what thoughts they might have to offer.
Very true. And speaking of more of a regional or local approach as far as government support, Clint Grant asks, busting silos will be key in tackling pressing issues surrounding climate change at our aging nation. Based on your experience, Danielle, what are key steps for busting these self-made silos to form partnerships while not being seen as overstepping or competing?
I mean, that is the greatest challenge, right? Is to get people marching in the same direction and not feeling, first of all, not doubling up on efforts and not feeling that you're overstepping. I do think that, putting forward sort of a vision for the kind of community that we want to be, that you want to be, and inviting people to contribute to how they can get there is a way to do that. And again, I don't mean to sound like a cheerleader specifically for age-friendly planning, but I do think that that's a really powerful tool to do that. If a community is to sort of set a goal for themselves that we want to be a place where people can age safely and securely in this community, the place where they've maybe lived their whole lives, or we want older adults to move here because we recognize that they're, a pretty powerful economic force in many cases. By setting that goal and that intention of how is it that we can create a place where people can age safely in this community, acknowledging the climate risks that we face, there are going to be more people that see themselves as having a hand in that than you might think. And my mind goes to things like Meals on Wheels delivery. This is where an aging services organization certainly has a stake in that outcome, but so too do developers who might want to be able to be responsive or anticipate the kind of new building forms that the city council or the county might begin to prioritize. So there are a lot of, I think, agents that can be and entities that can be supportive of that goal. But I think it really begins with setting that vision, articulating that vision of who you want to be as a community, and inviting people to figure out and to collaborate on how to get there.
And speaking of kind of community vision, Alana Prus asks, are there different challenges in more rural towns than in big cities, or are there different challenges and solutions?
Hi, Alana. And I love it when friends dial in. Yeah, I would say rural communities are uniquely challenged, I would say, in many ways, not just because of I think the traditional challenges that we face as smart growth advocates and new urbanists in creating density in rural communities. Um, Also, rural communities is a place already where older adults are disproportionately represented among the population. There's more than one community across this country that have suffered from sort of an outmigration of youth, and therefore many of the people who remain are older adults. And of course, there's also the challenge of housing conditions and housing quality. And I think in rural places, oftentimes the quality of housing is as much the challenge as is the supply, because there may be adequate supply, but it may be insufficient quality. So, what does that mean for sort of this issue? I think I think about the example of upstate New York, Tompkins County, where I was a few weeks ago. That's a fairly rural place, and even there, they see a real future for thinking about their even very small sort of market centers, if you will, the small hamlets that serve as touch points throughout a rural community that can accommodate growth, that can be the place where you're implementing those resilience hubs, where you're thinking about how to get services to people who live in a rural community. And also there's an amazing sense of community spirit often in rural places. That is a wonderful forum to bring some of these topics together. And I think oftentimes rural places are where you already see volunteer driving programs emerge and sort of natural organic support systems unfold to help people. And I think those kinds of solutions actually are going to be the recipe forward all across the country. We need more of those kinds of organic, community driven, voluntary mechanisms to support older adults wherever they live, whether it's rural communities or urban places.
Yes, yeah, the organic community and kind of communication that's already there is very important.
It really is. Yeah. And in that way, we really have a lot to learn, I think, from rural communities and how they sort of care for one another and look out for one another.
Absolutely. I think we have time for one more question here. So from Kenneth Santos, Kenneth asks, what in your experience are the biggest obstacles to achieving equity for seniors in an aging nation? And if you have any examples.
I mean, I can't think of a better example than the disaster and fatality rates, honestly. That is an example of just sheer inequity and somehow a level of comfort as a country that we appear to have with this hugely disproportionate effect on older adults. What is the cause for that? I think it goes back to a lack of understanding of older adults, who they are, what their needs are. It goes back to the fact that we don't even have a standard definition of what is an older adult. Variously, it's someone over 50 or over 55 or over 62 or over 65 or over 67. So we can't even kind of neatly define who this cohort is, which complicates planning efforts. It complicates the process of understanding their needs. And then, I'd be remiss if I didn't say that we have a very youth obsessed country, right? We don't talk about aging in a healthy way in this country. We don't, as I mentioned, when you hear the word aging, it's often the word anti in front of it. Aging is something to be fought against and to be prevented. It's not something that we necessarily plan for in a healthy and forward-looking way. And for all those reasons, I think we end up with these levels of inequity among older adults: poverty rates, housing cost burden, utility cost burden, which I didn't even talk about, health outcomes that frankly we haven't prioritized because we don't acknowledge or talk about them. I do think that beginning with the notion of applying an aging lens to some of these challenges is a way to start to unravel that inequity.
Wonderful. Yeah, I think right at that, we're just right at 1 o'clock. So I will wrap it up there. For all of our attendees, a recording of this webinar will be available tomorrow. You should get that by email. And I will also use this lovely plug from Jen at Island Press to remind everyone to use code webinar for 30% off this book. And thank you so much, Danielle. It's a really excellent book. This was really excellent conversation. And thank you for everybody who joined us today.
Thank you so much. It's really a joy to be here.
All right. Have a great day, everyone.
Bye.